Good afternoon, and welcome to this month's Public Health Practice Grand Rounds, brought to you by the Department of Health and Mental Hygiene and by the Mid-Atlantic Public Health Training Center. My name is Molly Mitchell, and I'm the coordinator for the Mid-Atlantic Public Health Training Center. And I'd like to welcome you to this month's presentation, Preventing Youth Violence, Strategies for Linking Communities and Schools to Keep Kids Safe. And before we begin today's presentation, I'd like to just make a couple of announcements for those of you who are watching online. Once you're on our website, please take a look at some of our online trainings we have on there, including public health nursing, as well as some of our archived public health practice grand rounds. And I'd like to bring your attention to a couple other trainings that are coming up, including investigating environmental public health complaints, trespass warning letters, and the law with Bernie Penner on June 23rd. And what does health reform mean for you, your business, or nonprofit? We're going to have two sessions with that panel on June 24th and June 25th. The June 25th session will be a live webcast, so for those of you watching online, you can come back on the 25th and watch that webcast about the new federal healthcare reform law. And our next month's public health practice grand rounds in July, on the third Wednesday of July, will be on injury prevention. We do ask, if you're watching online, to please take a moment to sign in. That will give us a better idea of how many people are watching online for our federal funders. And also, if you have any emailed questions for the presenters at any time, please email those to maphtc@jhsph.edu. And with that, I'll go ahead and introduce our presenters for today. Jonathan Bryce has served as Executive Director for Student Support and Safety since March 2007 in the Baltimore City Public School System, where he's responsible for the development, implementation, and coordination of student attendance, student placement, suspension services, student records, student counseling, and health services, including home and hospital, alternative education, and prevention and intervention support, and school police for 83,000 students. Prior to joining city schools, Jonathan had central office leadership and school-based administrative positions in Duval County Public Schools, in the Christina School District in Delaware, Anne Arundel County Public Schools, and Baltimore County Public Schools, and began his teaching career as a long-term substitute and student teacher in the Baltimore City Public Schools. Jonathan holds 4 degrees in AA in General Studies from Essex Community College, a BA in History from the University of Baltimore, an MS in Human Resource Development from Towson University, and an MA in Administration, Planning, and Supervision from Harvard University Graduate School of Education, where he expects to complete his doctoral degree in May 2011. And Dr. Philip Leaf is also joining us. Dr. Leaf is a professor in the Department of Mental Health at the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, with joint appointments in the Departments of Health Policy and Management, Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences, and the School of Education. He's the director of the Johns Hopkins Center for the Prevention of Youth Violence and the Senior Associate Director of the Johns Hopkins Urban Health Institute. Dr. Leaf has collaborated with the Maryland State Department of Education in the training of teams for more than 60% of all schools in Maryland. He has also been on the board of the Family League of Baltimore City, Baltimore's local management board, since 1994. And with that, I'm going to turn the floor over to Jonathan Bryce. Thank you.
Thank you. So good afternoon. Well, actually, yeah, I guess it's afternoon. Thank you for the opportunity to come and share with you some very key information in regards to how Baltimore City Public Schools, referred to from now on as city schools, attempts to link communities with the schools so that we can help our students to be safe. That's really one of our strategies and our goals as we attempt to build academic achievement. In terms of what I'm going to discuss today, I just want to give you a quick overview. We're going to start with the theory of action, not for city schools, but actually for my department at city schools, student support and safety. Take a look at some of our data, which is really broken out into 4 areas: prevention and awareness, early identification of student needs, youth development, and school and community-based interventions. as I get started, I'd just like to just share everybody. They gave my bio, and I've been in city schools for about 2.5, 3 years. And when I came to city schools, one of the things that I was tasked with doing was attempting to find a way to identify the needed areas that we needed to really build additional supports and focus so that we could help students to be successful, help schools to help students to be successful. As we were doing that work, one of the things we came up with was a lack of focus. And so hopefully what we've been able to do over the last few years is really build that focus in. And so our theory of action for student support and safety within city schools really focuses on a couple of areas. It focuses on improving attendance, building and maintaining those safe and supportive learning environments, which we think is critical, identifying early interventions. It does no good for us to wait until a student already exhibits poor behavior or some other type of negative interaction at the schoolhouse. We need to get to the students earlier with the support so that they can be successful. Something that we really, under the umbrella of youth development, it would be called promoting student voice and choice. And then lastly, we believe that school communities are able to make better decisions when we give them that level of support. I like to start my presentations out with data, and so I've provided some of the data for city schools over the last 4 or 5 years, with special attention paid to the time that Dr. Alonso, our school CEO, has been there, as well as the team that he's put in place, myself included. If you take a look, you'll see that our elementary numbers have gone up very greatly, about 0.6 over the last 3 years, and so we're very happy about that. Now, here's what we would tell you. We want 100% attendance at the elementary, middle, and high school level. So we recognize that we have some work to do, while at the same time we're very happy with what we're seeing at the elementary. We also are seeing substantial growth at our middle schools at 92.7. However, 94% would clearly be better, and that's what MSDE, the State Board of Education, requires for them to be successful. Lastly, you see high school. High school really is an area of tremendous need for us, where we have to focus on ways to engage young people in the schooling process. And we don't believe that it's something that can be done in isolation, but it needs the help of the community partners, which we'll talk about later on. But also, we need to take a moment and really refine what we're teaching in class to make sure that we're engaging young people so they can be successful. Another data point that we look at when we talk about attendance is when we talk about habitually truant students. Habitually truant students, the definition is at the bottom, but basically it means you've missed 20% or more of the school year, having been enrolled for at least 91 days. And so right now, the number is, let me find the cursor, right there. 6,377 students missed 20% or more of the school year. So what it really equates to is that a young person has missed more than 36 days out of a 180-day school year. Nobody could survive in their job if they missed that much time, and certainly the students that are missing this amount of class time and school time aren't doing well academically, are exhibiting other issues that we need to address as well. Suspensions. Just like we talk about attendance, we also look at the number of incidents of school-related violence that occur in our system. And as you see, back in 2003, 2004, we had over 26,000 incidents leading to suspension. Last year, 2008, 2009, it was down to 11,108. And so when I say down to, it's very difficult to decrease the level of student suspensions while at the same time increasing people's feelings of safety. And we've been able to do that delicate balance. And so we're very proud of that. Early indications are that the number of incidents leading to suspension this year will be lower than 10,000, which would be the first time in maybe 2 decades where that number has been that low. Very, very excited about that possibility. We'll know in about a week. No conversation about a school system would be appropriate without taking a look at our graduation rates as well as our dropout rates. As you can see, our graduation rate at the top is 62. Let me put the cursor there. 62.6%, while our dropout rate, the line at the bottom, is 7.9%. We expect to see an increase in both of those rates. So the graduation rate going up, the dropout rate going down for the school year, which ends today. And it'll take us a couple of weeks to run our final data and provide to MSDE and then release to the public. Very, very hopeful about the new figures that are going to come out. And later on in my presentation, I'll talk about some of the strategies we've implemented to really address keeping kids in school, helping them to be successful. This figure, many of you have seen. It's a pretty standard model that really relates to a tiered level of intervention. We use it for PBIS. I think it also is the same model that they use in public health, the primary, secondary, tertiary interventions, or the universal. And so really what we see is that we have to run two systems concurrently. We have to run academic systems that are focused on supporting all students to learn at high levels with the appropriate level of rigor, pushing those students to take advanced placement and more rigorous courses such as Algebra 1 in 8th grade, while at the same time we have to implement behavioral systems such as PBIS and other character education programs so that students are taught the appropriate ways of conducting themselves in the school setting. And we believe that if we do this well, that the only kids that we'll have to touch at the very deep end or at the top of the triangle are that 1 to 5% that need individual and intense interventions. And so really when we start talking about PBIS, I'll bring that model, or actually Phil will discuss that particular model in city schools. So what's it mean? Well, what it really means is that in city schools, we believe that we have to provide support inside and outside of the schoolhouse. So at our base, we would talk about prevention and awareness. Next, we talk about early identification of student needs, and concurrently, we also talk about youth development. And then really at the top, what we talk about are those school and community-based interventions that help young people to be successful in the classroom, in extracurricular activities, as well as in the broader community. So let's go to our first sort of our universal intervention, prevention and awareness. So there are a number of things on this slide that I'm going to address individually. Let's start with mental health services. We recognize that our young people come to school with a host of issues that are not related to school, that they may come to school dealing with the issues of normal adolescence. They may come to school dealing with issues related to their family structure, related to issues going on in the community, and everything else under the sun. The Baltimore City community and city schools started an initiative where they put mental health counselors into about 103 schools out of the 201 schools that we have. What we've seen in those schools is that the individuals have made a significant difference in the number of students that they're actually touching, helping to counsel either individually or in group. And in those schools where we see mental health counseling, we do see a reduction in student disciplinary incidents, and we do see a slight uptick in attendance as well as academic issues. Can we attribute the total causation to mental health counselors? We can't, but we certainly believe it's correlated with other good things that are going on within the school. If there's one thing on this chart that I think is critical for us to really understand, it's the program that we started about 2 years ago where we put youth workers into high need schools. I'd liken youth workers to Safe Streets. Phil, am I saying that correctly? Is it Safe Streets? Where we take individuals, and most of us know what Safe Streets are, where we take individuals that may have had prior interactions with the judicial system, have changed, turned their lives around, and now they serve as mediators and individuals that help to resolve conflict before it turns to violence in selected neighborhoods within Baltimore City, and also it's a program we borrowed from another city. Well, we've taken a variation of that, where we actually have individuals that are former gang members, former individuals that have been involved with the judicial system on the wrong side, that have paid their debt to society, and have now had a period of time where they are working with youth outside of the schools, where we can document that for more than 7 years they have been living, as normal citizens, obeying the law, doing those things. And now we have some of those individuals that receive training and then go into high need schools to provide support and mediation to young people. And the schools that we have these individuals in, we have seen a marked decrease in incidents of violence. It has been like night and day. And so that's something that we certainly think is a program worthy of research, worthy of hopefully replication, not only in other schools in Baltimore City, but also in other schools across the country. When we talk about drug and violence prevention curricula and substance abuse prevention, certainly we believe our health education program, as well as other programs within city schools, are really tasked with giving kids a clear understanding about the dangers of becoming involved with risky or risk-type behaviors. I know Dr. Phil Leaf's going to talk about some risk behaviors later on, but certainly our curricula and health education is intended to make sure that young people understand the risk and are making wise decisions before they get involved in those types of behaviors. Attendance-related strategies. I can't say enough about how important attendance is. I tell our school CEO, Dr. Andres Alonso, almost every day when I see him, if we're having a conversation about school and how we're doing, that attendance is the key variable. We can't do anything unless kids first show up in school. And so it's critically important for us to get them there. And we've taken a number of steps this year to ensure that students are there, that will be discussed later on. But one of them is having an automated system where every day by 11 o'clock, we call every student's home who's absent in city schools. It has made a difference, because now you'll hear parents, now you'll hear students, "Oh, you're the person that called my house. Could you stop calling my house?" My response to them is, "Start coming to school." And so we really are starting to see some buy-in with that. As I mentioned earlier, PBIS expansion. So we've really undergone a significant expansion in city schools from about 44 schools when I walked in the door to 61 this current year. And our expectation is that we have another 40 schools lined up to receive training for PBIS, which is positive behavior intervention supports. It's a whole school character education strategy. And so those new schools are going to receive training this summer, as well as the returning schools. And we really think that we're at a tipping point where more schools in the system will be PBIS schools than not. And that should also have help to have a marked decrease on the number of students that are involved in disciplinary incidents, that aren't coming to school, and so forth. School resource officers. Baltimore City is one of the few school systems that have their own police force. Most major school systems borrow all their officers from the local police. We believe it's an advantage because it allows us to provide them with even more training than they would normally receive. Based on that training and some of the things we do, we're able to really help them understand youth and children. And so as a result, their interactions tend to be focused on de-escalation rather than immediately going to a situation where maybe an arrest is imminent or something like that. And lastly, having our own police force helps us to be really current, to stay really current with the latest gang intelligence, so that we hopefully can stay one step ahead of the young people that are exhibiting those signs of negative involvement. I told you I'd talk about attendance. So in terms of attendance, I already mentioned the Global Connect, which is the second bullet point right there. We implemented a new attendance reporting system in city schools for the 09-10 school year. It was the first year where we required all secondary schools to take attendance by period. So previously, students could come to school, and as long as they were marked present, if they missed the rest of the day or something, the system didn't track that. Now the system actually tracks that. And so what we start to see is students having better attendance in class and their class attendance matching their overall daily attendance. I think the other big issue or really win that we've had this year are conducting the attendance hearings at central office as well as at some of the school sites. And then lastly, an example of us working with community partners is something called the Students Attendance Work Group, where we invite a number of community, non-government organization partners to the table to really identify strategies to improve student attendance and then make a determination as to how we can implement them in city schools. And that's been very effective. Switching over to the early identification of student needs. So early identification for us is really about getting to students before they require deep in intervention. Let me say that again. Getting to students before they require deep in intervention. We don't want to wait until the student has failed the school year. We don't want to wait until the student has been retained not once, but maybe twice or three times before we intervene, where maybe we're now talking about providing special education services where previously it would have been maybe just some tutoring services. So our focus is getting to students earlier that are exhibiting difficulties in one of four areas. Those four areas are attendance, behavior, academics, as well as socio-emotional status. And so because of those four areas, we actually implement something called student support teams. It's required by COMAR, but we've really been pushing it. And as you can see, last year we had 3,100 SST meetings. This year, as of 2 days ago, we had 3,800. So we're increasing the number of meetings for our young people. Based on the meeting, the student gets a plan. The school then goes back and implements the plan and makes sure that the plan is being implemented well, and then comes back to the table to say, okay, we put an SST plan in place for Jonathan. How did he respond? Did he respond appropriately? Are his issues being improved? If they are, then let's keep it in place. If they're not, let's do a modification. And so that's really an SST or student support team process. Something else we've done for students in Baltimore City is we've actually redesigned our alternative schools and programs. Alternative schools tend to have a bad connotation. That's where the bad kids go. First and foremost, we don't believe we have bad kids in city schools. We believe that we have young people that need support from the school system, from community partners, from their parents. And part of our job was to identify what needs they had and then to build it. And so this is what we did. As you see across the top, we actually have 4 AOP schools, and they're the ones in green. And so they're based really on high school credit recovery or overage middle school students. When we got here, we found that there were several thousand overage middle school students and several thousand overage high school students. When a student is overage, that means that maybe they're 15 and instead of being in the 10th grade, they're in the 8th grade. That student is more likely to come to school not be engaged in the lesson, but instead be engaged in all of those negative behaviors that we all talk about, leading to school-based problems as well as community-based problems. And so we felt that we had a responsibility to really address that. Success Academy is the new building or the new school that we built at central office, where we take only high school students that have been expelled from school. So supposedly these are the worst of the worst kids. We take them into our own building. We have a great principal, great staff. We have therapeutic services as well as extracurricular activities for them. And we really help the students to come to grips with their issues, both academically and behaviorally, until, so that we can then send them back to their school and they can be successful. Early data indicates that they're going back and that they're not committing acts that would get them back to expulsion. So the rate of recidivism is relatively low. Down the side, you see programs. The other thing that we recognize in city schools is that you need to have programs for younger kids, because sometimes if we catch the behavior early enough, remember early identification, then we can change it so that it doesn't happen later. So we really work to expand our middle school alternative program as well as our elementary school alternative. Last thing I'll say about this slide, there are many students that are clearly intelligent, but for whatever reason cannot graduate in the normal manner. 4 years of a traditional high school experience is not something that their life condition or other issues that they may be dealing with will allow them to deal with. So what we had to identify are other ways to get our young people the information and the knowledge they need so that they could graduate. And so at the bottom, you see other programs that we have implemented that help our young people to be successful, earn the credits that they must earn, but do it in an accelerated manner so that they can get on with their life. Great Kids Come Back. Great Kids Come Back really deals with the issue of students that have previously dropped out of school, and now the school system has said, we want to go out and we want to get them back. Little secret, the city schools gets a negative consequence for going out, getting students to come back and re-engage in school, and the student drops out again. So that student isn't counted once, that student could actually be counted twice. So that's a disincentive for us to go out and get the students. However, we believe we have a moral obligation to really go out and to say, not getting an education is not going to prepare you for the rest of your life. And so we want you to come back. And so we're willing to take that hit. But we're also having conversations with the State Board of Education to see if they can do something that would change. So here's the latest complete year data. Out of the 925 students who dropped out from January to June, just in that 6-month span, 335 were identified for re-enrollment in high school GED. So about a third, right? Out of that third, 252 attended city schools, high schools, or other programs. 15 graduated. All right. And so we believe that that's 15 students that graduated that wouldn't have graduated before. And we know that we're still working with a bunch of that 252 to make them successful so that they can eventually graduate. In 09-10, we did the same effort again, that those students who dropped out from January to June 09, it was 761. We went and knocked on doors. We held multiple events, and we were able to get 76 students that came back through the fairs, 38 students re-enrolled in city schools, 27 went to GED programs. And so it is a concerted effort for a very difficult population to go out and to bring them away from whatever life events they're dealing with back into a school setting. So this just talks about dropout prevention. Two things. We talk about youth development, and part of youth development is creating conditions for youth to have a decision in what they're doing while they're at school, but also what schools they attend. And so one of the things that we've expanded in our school system is the idea of choice, school choice. So we now have school choice for all students in high school. What that means is every 8th grader in our school system is required to complete an application and to choose the schools they would like to attend. And so the data clearly indicates that the last complete year we had 96.8% of the students, and we received over 5,400 applications. They chose what school they wanted to attend. Why is that important? Well, we believe it's important because that's how you engage young people. Young people that are forced to attend a school that they have no interest in attending are young people that are likely not to be engaged, not to attend well, to be disciplinary problems while they're there. And so giving them a choice in what schools they attend should lead to higher outcomes. And so, again, we're seeing some preliminary data that indicates that that's a smart decision on our part. The other part of youth development is about student voice. And so this is the first year where we have required all schools that have grades 6 through 12, so all secondary schools, to have a youth development program. Now, they can either buy it off the shelf from us, or they can develop their own. And we're sort of agnostic in it. We don't care how they do it one way or another. But what we know is that students that are engaged in extracurricular activities at school have a higher level of attendance, have better achievement, academic achievement, and have lower incidence of disciplinary issues, right? So our idea is getting more students involved in school will lead to higher outcomes. One of the programs we have that we developed at Central Office is called Youth Ambassadors, where young people are involved from 30 different schools in youth leadership and development strategies, and then they go back into their schools and they create a youth development club where they work on community service projects or service learning projects. They work on ways to strengthen the school community. The other youth development program that we really advocate is student government. For us, it's called ASCBC, Associated Student Congress of Baltimore City, and we expect to see one of those in all of our secondary schools as well. The last piece of this is how we link to community agencies and to non-government organizations. And so just one, I'll tell you two actually great supports that we have. Our connection to the Department of Social Services, our connection to the Department of Juvenile Services. Both of those agencies have placed staff members within city schools to support students. And so that's not something that's typically done. But what we have identified is by placing those staff members within city schools, able to really connect and touch with students, that we're able to cut down the amount of time it takes to refer a student in need of additional support. And so we see that as critical. We have collaborations with the state's attorney's office, partnerships with places like the University of Baltimore in terms of their truancy court, partnerships with Johns Hopkins around PBIS that Dr. Leaf will talk about. I think one other thing which is critical, a lot of the work that we do in student support and safety can only be done because we're taking the research and the best thinking of not just ourselves internally, but also folks like Dr. Leaf at Johns Hopkins Center for Prevention of Youth Violence, folks like Jane Sundias at OSI. We work with a number of the foundations in the city to really come up with a comprehensive way to connect the schoolhouse and the things that happen in the schoolhouse to the broader community so that students will be safe, but also that students will be able to achieve academically. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan. We start off with schools. When I first came to Baltimore about 20 years ago, there were literally 8 schools in the entire school system where 40% or more of the children were achieving at grade level. We had more than 20 schools where less than 10% of the schools, students in the schools were achieving at grade level. And that for years and years, the consequences of not learning how to read in first or second and third grade, but when one student, in some classes, no students in the entire school are learning to read at grade level, it's hard to blame the students when they're in 8th grade or 12th grade and still not reading. But unfortunately, they're also engaged in a lot of other activities. And we still have, unfortunately, the history of some of our students who went through the school system at that time. But I think it's important to point out, Jonathan pointed out, that the school system, city schools, has made an adjustment recognizing where some of the students were, It's interesting when they put some of these alternative schools in, sometimes we don't have a lot of new school buildings in Baltimore City. So they're sharing a school building in a neighborhood school, and there is often some concern from the neighborhoods about having these students coming in, these, as Jonathan said, these, quote, bad students. It turns out that the attendance for the students that are in the alternative schools, because the schools are structured to meet their needs in terms of the coursework, in terms of the staff, that when there are incidences, they're much more likely to be the students who are attending the neighborhood school. The attendance rates are much better. The disciplinary rates are much less, even though these are, again, often children who have had disciplinary problems in addition to having their academic problems. But I think it's important for the health professionals and other people to realize that the schools in Maryland, and I think many other states, have improved enormously over the last 10 or 15 years. Teaching practices have gotten better, attention to student achievement has gotten better, both in terms of having a good start with expanded early childhood work, but also better remedial services. What that means, though, is that children that are having problems, whether they're academic problems or behavioral problems, are also much more likely to have mental health, substance abuse, family, asthma, which causes them not to attend regularly, other health problems that are co-occurring with what may be getting identified as violence problems. I actually started off as someone developing community-based mental health services, and I think as some of you who, I guess maybe not who are watching, because you would have an interest or inclination that public health and violence have something to do together. But I don't know whether any of you have driven around in East and Western England, and literally there's a highway, and you sort of are driving on the highway, and if you pull off in a certain place, you literally run into Stonehenge. You run into something that clearly is not what you would expect, when, at least in the U.S., when you see signs saying coming soon, usually 50 or 100 miles away. No signs for this. You literally pull into it. If you notice, there's actually no fences around it. You can go over and touch these things. But I think increasingly the issues of violence and public health and education are coming together as co-occurring in communities, and we need common solutions. And I think there's an enormous amount that public health professionals can do. This is a building that was firebombed a number of years ago. There was a family of 7 that was living there, 6 children, 5 of whom were home at the time and died, and the mother and father, the Dawsons. And this actually just happens to be the day afterwards. This was not a formally occurred call thing. This was just people coming out who were enormously affected by this. I use this as an example because actually the young man who did this was a city legislative page, someone who had actually been doing fairly well academically. Got involved with sort of some of the wrong people in that neighborhood, and as a consequence, he's now spending a lot of time in jail. But people were concerned, again, spontaneously and for called remembrances, and you get an interesting mix of people there in terms of former legislators and other people. You also have elected people everywhere from the lieutenant governor to our congressmen to state delegates to state senators to local city council people coming together to try to come up with solutions. And unfortunately, I think the solutions, as Jonathan were alluding to, are really needing to come together with community folks and health professionals and educators to come up with these things. And we sometimes lose sight of the fact that the people who are also the victims and the friends of the victims are enormously impacted by these losses. This is a crash we see much less frequently in Baltimore than we did a number of years ago, because there actually are substantially fewer people getting killed. But the majority of people who are getting killed actually are 18 to 24. They're older brothers and sisters of people in our school system. Sometimes they're parents of people in our school system. But I have a friend who says, hurt people hurt people. And I think one of the things that's very important for the mental health professionals and the health professionals to realize is that some of the mental health services that we are providing, whether it's in school or in our mental health services and our substance abuse services, are not taking into account that a lot of these people have also been traumatized. and that doing things that are been shown to be effective, like trauma-informed cognitive behavioral therapies or other kind of therapies, we do have these programs. But if you looked in your own schools, it's probably not likely that many of the clinicians, if you looked in your own communities, it's probably not likely that many of the clinicians have actually been trained on these or are using these things. And I think one of the things the health professionals that are in the room and watching this, or will be watching this on the internet, is sort of looking at what are the things that you're responsible for, and are they taking into account that a lot of the people that you're serving have had trauma in their lives, have been involved in these instances. Again, it's not only people that like ourselves who lose relatives who are enormously saddened by this. These are losses that are affecting everybody, including the people in these neighborhoods. The challenge is we often have enormously complicated models, and before I got involved in schools, the way schools try to do things was sort of a mystery to me. I find talking to people in schools, the way we organize our health services and our systems of healthcare are mysteries to most of the people in the healthcare system. And so whether it's a community-wide strategy, whether it's effective mental health or substance abuse or healthcare, one of the things that doesn't necessarily come together is really getting these services to those people who are in need, and also having effective prevention services. More and more, because of fiscal and other things, the things that work in terms of supporting parents early on, making sure children get off to a good start is sort of lost. So that one of the miracles that we're going to talk about, and I don't think it's a miracle, Jonathan alluded to it, is really having these collaborations between community folks, between school people, and increasingly between the students themselves in terms of informing what are some of the needs, what are some of the solutions, and why is it some of the things that we put in place that may be evidence-based practices and may be working in lots of places, are either not being implemented with fidelity or not being seen as being useful by our consumers. Now clearly, the public health model, we want to be able to detect and define the problems. And these days, with the media issues around cyberbullying and in-school bullying, but the children have been enormous victims of injuries. There's an enormous number of fights that young people are involved in. Increasingly, there are people who are carrying weapons. When we do surveys, though, we find that they're not necessarily carrying weapons because they're concerned about what's going on in the schools. They're concerned about getting to school safely and getting home safely. So when we're thinking about prevention of violence, we need to be thinking about what's going on in the neighborhoods. Increasingly, there's concern about bullying. It's also the leading cause of death for African Americans, the second leading cause of death for Hispanics aged 10 to 24, and the third leading cause for Native Americans and Asian and Pacific Islanders in the U.S. is actually homicide. And so as a public health professional, if we find something that is a leading cause of death, we at least think there is some sort of health relevance, or we may be able to provide an important role. This is sort of a map of Baltimore City, and the little blue and red things are schools. This is a year or so from police data on where incidents took place that the police considered to be gang-related. And you can see I live up here in Baltimore City. There's not too many gang incidences in my neighborhood. Where I work, there's a considerable number of gang incidences. However, if you put the gang incidences are now over blue, which are blue, over the red dots, which are now schools, you also see that some schools are just located in communities where there's more violence. If we map drug use, there'd be more drug use going on. That there's just more challenges. And I think as we're thinking about these issues, whether we're just simply citizens, there's a term that Dr. Alonso has coined in terms of fair student funding and moving funds for schools so that the schools have the flexibility of using them for their needs. Fair funding may not be, however, every school getting the same amount per capita because of the nature of the challenges of the students. Most of the people who live, again, in my neighborhood, we have some single-parent families, but a lot of two-parent families. Most people in my neighborhood are at least college graduates, if not more. They think education is important. They not only spend time with their children, but they also have the capacity to spend time with their children to help them with their education. Increasingly, we have a number of families who are working one or two jobs. Sometimes families are not fully aware of either the content of the educational activities, particularly if you get into middle or high school, and some of these individuals didn't quite make it through 8th or 9th grade. So the issues of having support services for these families, and I raise this in the context of a public health presentation because, again, many of the children that we serve in our mental health clinics and our substance abuse clinics who have chronic health problems are not fully participating in what may be extensive array of out-of-school and after-school programs because of the issues of getting parental permission. Parents who are using drugs are notoriously less likely to sign parent forms when they come home from school, when they come home to get signed, and most programs require parental consent. If there's not an attempt to engage these children and their families, often they are not necessarily the easiest and least costly people to deal with. And so programs are not necessarily incentivized to try to make sure that they're actually reaching out to these children. So if they get them and they come back, there's not often a major attempt to get them to come back in. So I think these are things. And increasingly, it's also important to note that probably 97, if not even more, percent of our young folks are using the internet. And increasingly, there's both in Anne Arundel County, Howard County, Baltimore City, the issues of using the internet for harassment. I mean, we have a whole world out there where people are accessible either through the internet or through cell phones. And for young people, it's more through their cell phones and text messaging, 24/7. That they have lots of people who they have phone numbers for. They are very interested in keeping in contact with each other, yet how to both come up with sort of the appropriate ways of using, whether it's phones or internets, and how as adults we can intervene is really an uncharted territory that we're all sort of dealing with. But this is, again, one of the challenges that are affecting us in terms of violence, as well as terms of harassment. So we know there's a lot of problems out there. We know that all of our youth have access to things like phones where they could become victims. It's not simply hanging out with the wrong people or being in a classroom or in a neighborhood where people sort of see who people are hanging out with. It's very difficult to monitor the phones on the real time. So we've identified a number of factors that are related to violence, such as poverty, poor parental supervision, harsh and erratic discipline, having delinquent peers, drug use, dropping out of school, mental health problems. We've also identified, however, a lot of things that can intervene with these things, both prevention as well as early intervention, as Jonathan alluded to. We find that a large number of children who are going to drop out or become involved with violence, become involved with drugs, delinquency in middle school or high school can be identified as early as first grade. We also find that when we put programs in first grade, things like positive behavioral interventions and supports, or the good behavior game, or social emotional programs like positive thinking alternatives, paths, we're able to actually greatly reduce the number of children who wind up becoming violent, who wind up using drugs later on. Even in communities that are where these are high prevalence. I'm often asked, well, this is sort of Baltimore, and look at all the violence out there. Does parental monitoring really matter in Baltimore? And if parents get engaged in even their 6th and 7th or 8th graders, if they weren't doing it before, does that make a difference? And we actually have data that shows that when you can engage parents to become more involved in their children's lives, regardless of the age of their children, they are much less likely to be engaged in violence. And so it is never too late. And although it is much more difficult to engage middle school and high school parents in their children's lives. And part of that is because their children are much less likely to want them to be actively involved in their lives, at least publicly. That we find that these things can happen, and that when you actually convene groups with children, and not publicly, but talk to them, they actually are appreciative of the structure. That one of the issues around the gangs is they provide structure. They provide love and nurturing, or what is perceived as love and nurturing, and that is one of the attractions where people who, again, may personally admit to loving their parents and being very concerned about their their mother, sometimes their father, even though they might not be in contact with them, but they're not sort of getting the day-to-day supports. And those are things that we need to do with. There are some naturally inherent things that make things less predisposing to violence. We find that people who have higher intelligence are able to sort of stay in school with a little less attainment or attention, and being in school is a good thing. But we also know that positive social orientations, religiosity, having parents who are intolerant to certain levels of behaviors, and then the students and the young people themselves pick that up, are very important protective factors. Families and neighborhoods are enormously important. When we have families who are not very connective, and again I go back to many of our parents who are in treatment for whether it's mental health problems or substance abuse problems or chronic health problems, are often pretty disengaged from their own families, from their communities, and it's very hard for them to find supports, whether it's their own lives or for their children's lives. Their children observe what's going on, and so they don't stay connected to the community. Having abilities and an interest in talking to children about what they're doing, having high expectations. Unfortunately, many of our parents in our communities really don't have high expectations for their children. As Jonathan said, on a number of instances, one of the things the schools and people who work in city schools are concerned about is making sure that despite what the children may be doing now, they have to have higher expectations. They have to believe that with good programs and observing what had been done with other children in the past, that there can be achievement. But again, many of us sometimes forget those things. We also have children who come to school hungry, go home hungry. One of the things Baltimore City is doing is actually providing extensive afternoon meals for children. They've also provided extensive breakfasts for children in addition to sort of the traditional lunches. And we find this is not just important for having children having food, but it also provides teaching and learning opportunities. And it provides opportunities having positive social relationships in ways that are very useful. And then clearly, inculcating the importance of schools. We had some focus groups with students as part of the attendance campaign that Jonathan mentioned, because a lot of high school students are not coming very regularly. And these were a range of students, some of whom were doing well in school, some of whom weren't doing so well in school. Almost none of them thought it was important to go to school regularly. They thought, if they go 3 or 4 times a week, that's actually going pretty regularly. And some weeks, if you didn't go a couple of weeks, as long as you sort of could pass, that was going on. But when we asked what they were doing outside of school and the opportunities that presented and who they were congregating with, they started realizing that being in school itself is a positive thing, as Jonathan talked about. So again, as health professionals, whatever we can do to try to facilitate students being in school or being with positive attitudes are really important. Now, there's a lot of risk factors and there's a lot of programs out there. The positive thing is there are not too many risk factors for violence that actually aren't risk factors for other things. And that we often create our silos. We have the youth violence folks, and we have the substance abuse treatment people, and we have the teenage pregnancy prevention people, and we have the school dropout people, and maybe the social emotional learning people. But when you actually look at the risk factors and its impact on different outcomes, whether it's substance use or delinquency or early pregnancy or dropout or violence, programs that are working to engage positive behaviors, having favorable attitudes about these behaviors, early interventions. If we're thinking about individual factors, if you look at family factors, the family negative factors are not just factors for youth violence. And so we think that there's actually lots of opportunities when we come together thinking about children and families, not thinking about delinquents or people who have been suspended or assaulted children or drug-using children or children with mental illnesses or children that are pregnant, which sort of narrows the discussions. But when we're thinking about what is it we need to be supporting these children or preventing these things, that we actually can focus on lots of common risk factors. The same thing, the community risk factors tend to be risk factors across a number of different factors, whether it's the legal factors and easy access to firearms or drug use or cigarettes or other things. And again, it's not necessarily just having the laws, but whether they're enforced, whether there's a community culture that is not appropriate to sell alcohol to people under 21 or not appropriate to sell cigarettes to people under 21. And then obviously also in some of our communities, the fact that economic deprivation, poverty presents risks and reduces assets are things that we all need to be coming together. And it turns out that not having good schools, having bad behaviors in schools, not having schools where there's positive commitment actually turns out to be a risk factor to a lot of our health outcomes. And so again, as health professionals, having effectively functioning schools that not just have children graduate, but where the children and their families are positively connected to the value of education, to the value of positive peer relationships in the schools are really critical and not sort of irrelevant to what may be our other health interests. And likewise, there are also a lot of peer factors, particularly when we're talking about adolescents and young adults, that trying to provide these positive opportunities and positive engagements among positive youth with other youth in structured situations are really important. Okay. So one of the things that when we think about from the education, it's sort of teaching. And if we now think that there are children who are coming into school or observing on a day-to-day basis, whether it's in the media or in their families, things about behaviors that we don't really want to have in our schools or don't think that's acceptable, if we don't set up places where children can get taught, it's again, why do we think these things are going to happen by themselves? Whether we're thinking about health behaviors, whether we're thinking about interpersonal relationships, when we use this when we're doing our training for positive interventions and supports, when children can't read, we teach them to read. If they can't swim, we teach them to swim. If they can't multiply, we teach them to multiply. If we want them to learn how to drive, we teach them to drive. If they're not behaving, and the usual answer is not that we teach them. It's usually we punish them, we send them home and think that they'll get better in 3 days, or 6 days, or 10 days. We segregate them amongst themselves so they don't impact on the other good children in the classroom, but we fail to realize that they go home and hang out with these children after school. They're their siblings, they're their next door neighbors. And so really thinking about teaching is really something that's important. And I think the idea that universal intervention, sometimes we think about universal interventions as only prevention and it stops if we haven't prevented things. But we need to think about these things as needing to go on during different developmental phases. So if children are now in middle school and having problems, they still need to have positive opportunities. They still need to be taught about appropriate behaviors, and they still need to get reinforced, not just negatively when they do things wrong, but often not reinforcing them positively. We know that you want to have a high ratio of positive reinforcements to negative reinforcements, whether it's with our own children or we're teaching our employees. If we only yelled at them when they did something wrong and didn't commend them for doing work and commend them frequently for doing little things they're doing well, and it's very interesting when you interact with some of these young people or even with young children. They are so rarely provided positive feedback of their behaviors that there are often enormous large numbers of positive ways of doing those things. Another issue that Jonathan sort of alluded to, though, is if we're doing these things, we need to think about these as long-term commitments and sustainable. That they can't just be simply programs that sort of get put in place till the problem is resolved, because the developmental challenges means that we're always going to have, middle school age children. We're always going to have high school age children. We're always going to have young adults. And therefore, there's always the positive thing, hopefully, is there always is another cohort of children coming in. So that if we're thinking about prevention or early intervention, we need to be doing these things. We find that not having teams are making it much more difficult to sustain these things, and so it's useful to have established teams, having high expectations, and that means that we as health professionals who may only be partners on some of these things also need to have high expectations, as we hope other people have high expectations about what we're doing. Using data, having information, supports, whether it's district level support for schools or community level supports for mental health services, these are all things that we need. And I use positive behavioral intervention supports as an example of things that we probably could do better with our health, mental health kind of activities. And that what we do is we go into the unit of the school, we train school teams, but they have coaches. So there's actually somebody working in the natural unit that has a coach. They're working on how the classrooms can be made more effective. At the school district level, there's a point person who's working on what's going on. And Maryland has actually created sort of a state-level team, so we actually are meeting monthly. Now, when this started, the first year there were 11 school teams that were trained, and by the end of the first year, 9 of them weren't really even doing the model anymore, because there wasn't any coaching, there wasn't anything going together. Since that time, we've actually trained more than 60% of the schools in the state. And that one of the things that's happened at the state level is we as the PBIS management team can no longer train these things. So we actually have 6 coalitions that are school system or multi-school systems coalitions that are actually taking on now the training, the continued support of these things. And these things now are integrated both into professional development days, but some are training activities where there's training on gaps. And again, in terms of a sustainable model, not just in terms of the content of PBIS, but organizing things that can go to scale, we think this is a good model. We have a lot of mental health and mental health services that are effective for dealing with both prevention of risk or intervention of risk. And so we need, as health professionals, to really support these things. It's hard to be thinking too much about a nurse home visiting program to support healthy births as a prevention program, but we know that children who are born healthier, whose parents are supported in having the child who's born healthy now become a successful, healthy toddler. If there are challenges in the household with the child's health, or in the family in terms of abuse and neglect or parental depression, and we have a lot of postpartum depression among mothers, being able to get that detected early, and home visitors who've developed relationships with these mothers early on and can see the changes in the mother are often able to get the person into treatment because they have a relationship. So we need to be thinking about these things as mental health and violence prevention programs. But also, we have a lot of programs that we tend to use only after really bad things happen to children, including out-of-home placements, multisystemic therapy, functional family therapy. We need to be thinking about making these more accessible to schools for children that they're able to identify as potentially having large costs, including dropout later on, where they may be very successful of being able to get these interventions. Most of these interventions are time limited, they're not lifetime interventions, but if we could make them more accessible in a timely fashion to problems that schools are able to identify, again, these children go on to have major personal problems and societal costs. And we have in many of our communities these mental health and health professionals trained to be able to link those together. They've been shown to be effective at reducing both overall violence as well as arrests, gang involvement, and then Jonathan alluded to the programs in the schools. We have some schools that are in neighborhoods where there's a lot of gang activity. One of the things that people in Baltimore have been able to do, and I am not one of the people, is actually get schools declared safe zones, that neutral territories for gangs, because the multiple gangs the people running them, and particularly the older people who used to run them, have their children and grandchildren and nieces and nephews in their schools. And it's one thing to sort of be doing initiations, beating up the other folks who are not gang members, but then their non-involved gang folk, children also, and family members become victims. So everything from involving everybody in the community to sort of see schools and education as being important, to again creating positive relationships. And again, some of these people who have turned their lives around, some of them have gotten masters and gotten professional degrees, some of them have just turned their lives around and are now just hardworking folks who are trying to raise their own families. But they're able to, both through personal example as well as engage in conflict mediations and resolutions, do things, whether it's in schools and in the communities. We also, as health workers, need to realize that programs and interventions themselves are not solutions. Now, we're all very positive about healthcare reform and the fact that a lot of our families will now have healthcare and may be more accessible for getting mental health and substance abuse and other services, but those things are not going to happen by themselves. And we know that a lot of the parents and a lot of the youth who may need programs are not necessarily amenable to actually accessing those programs. And so we need to be thinking about how our own communities are going to make these programs accessible and effective for people who traditionally did not use them, even people who traditionally had health care coverage. We need better ways of organizing. We're now pretty much organized by silos. You know, we get money for mental health, or we get money for substance abuse, or pregnancy prevention, or education, and it's not enough money to either do those things, or certainly to support the children and the family needs. And so we need to figure out better ways of braiding and the funds and connecting the dots. And we have a lot of programs that are really not being implemented very effectively. It may be because staff are overextended and don't have the time to do it. It may be because they weren't adequately trained, or they got trained, didn't use the programs for too long, and therefore they sort of forgot how to do them. But I think, you know, making sure that that we are looking at both the programs, whether they're having high fidelity and how they're being used, are critical. This is a website for the PBS Maryland group, which will allow you to see a lot of things that are going on in schools throughout the state, as well as links around the country. And then for more information about some of the violence prevention programs that I've talked about, some that Jonathan's talked about, you can find those on our website. Thank you.
Thank you, Jonathan, and thank you, Dr. Leaf. We now have time in the program for questions for either presenter. So again, if you are watching online, you can just scroll down to the bottom of the page and click on the link for emailing questions, and we can go ahead and start if anyone here in the live audience has questions for either presenter. Yeah.
Understanding better how schools get designated as being persistently violent. Having been involved in some discussions in different schools, there's some sort of disincentives to principals and school administrators to report or exact punishment for particular things that are going on in the schools, because then they will get designated as persistently violent. So I don't really understand what the situation is, but there seem to be some perverse incentives going on.
Yes, thank you for your question about persistently dangerous schools. So in the most recent Elementary and Secondary Education Act, ESA, but its common name is No Child Left Behind, there is a persistently dangerous statute that requires state Department of Education to identify schools that are persistently dangerous based on some sort of calculation that they've determined, and where those schools have been identified, to provide for student transfers out of those schools, because no one wants students to attend a persistently dangerous school. Two things, maybe three, about that. Number one, across the entire country, Maryland is really the only state that enforces that persistently dangerous clause. When I was in Jacksonville, Florida, in another school system, there are no persistently dangerous schools there. My understanding is that there are no persistently dangerous schools in Texas, in California, or in New York. So first and foremost, it shouldn't really be a provision of No Child Left Behind that is being enforced. However, it is being enforced. And what does this really mean for city schools? Number one, it means that in some cases, there are schools where one of 7 serious events occurred, resulting in a suspension for longer than 10 days. We have continued to work with our schools to build safer and more supportive learning environments, but our CEO has been very clear to principals that you have to call it like you see it, and that if a student commits a violent offense, they should receive the appropriate consequence as outlined in our code of conduct. And that one of the ways that we sort of guard against principals not reporting is that every Friday I convene a meeting of a number of different departments within central office called Safety Stat, where we review every disciplinary incident that's occurred in city schools in the prior week. And if we see something that doesn't look like it was handled in accordance with the code of conduct, we send a code of conduct violation letter to the principal, asking the principal to explain why they didn't, what their rationale for how they handled the particular situation. It's not used in an evaluative sense, but it is used in a way to help, sort of build the capacity of our principals to make sure that they're adhering to the tools that have been provided to address student violence. I think the third point that I would make about persistently dangerous schools, all school leaders in the state of Maryland have a choice about what type of school they want to have. If they want a school that has 0 suspensions, they could have it. They just have to be prepared to live with the consequences. If they want a school that has a high number of suspensions, they also have to be prepared to live with those consequences. We're very clear. We don't want schools that are unsafe, where learning environments are not positive. And it would be a serious error in judgment on the part of a principal to not report and not to appropriately deal with disciplinary incidents because they were worried about persistently dangerous, because they wouldn't be there long enough to worry about persistently dangerous. Their climate data, their suspensions, the number of parent complaints would all provide information that says maybe there's something going on at that school. You need to go and take a deeper look. We'd go take a deeper dive, and either they would get it together and adhere to the code, or there would be a principal change. And since Dr. Alonso's been here, he has changed about, I think the current number is about 70 out of 200 principals.
Are there more supports provided to those schools when they actually end up in that category?
So one of the things that's happened, so let me just back up your question a little bit, because the underlying part of the question is if there's only a negative response to an event. And so one of the things that actually Jonathan, it started before Dr. Alonso got here, but he was enormously supportive of it, was the review of this Code of Student Conduct. Because most codes of student conduct say students will behave, and then there's 18 pages that get sent home to every parent about all the bad things that will happen to your child if he or she misbehaves, and here's your appeals that you can do. And as Jonathan said, a group of people from the schools, city schools, as well as the community, got together to sort of say, how do we create positive behaviors? What is the responsibility of the school? What is the responsibility of the student? What is the responsibility of the parent for student behaviors? And what are the responses? And the responses aren't necessarily, suspension or negative things. It's looking at, at levels. Now, obviously, if someone brings a gun into a school, there's a specific response. But there's usually a whole range of activities that sort of escalate into a fight. And the issue, and some children who may be involved in more or less of these, or some classrooms that may have more or less of these things. And so part of the reviews that Jonathan alluded to, going back to our the achievement gap, is if you have no students who are who say first grade, where people are coming in reasonably close to being at grade level, even in Baltimore City, and even now at above grade level. And if they're not achieving during that 1 year they're in school, sort of 1 year of learning consistently, well, maybe that's a teacher or a school problem, not necessarily every single student came in there with problems. And so I think what's been put in place is, thinking about these as a continuum, and what should be going on to prevent these things from happening? Did those things go into place? And then at the back end, the federal government has only now started to put resources in for schools that have been designated as persistently violent. And those resources include everything from extra resources for educational opportunities, extra resources for mental health services, but also what the Baltimore City Schools have done is put together some work opportunities, because again, many of these children who are engaging in these activities are sort of coming in a little bit tired from working illegal activities all night to make some money for their families, and actually putting in some legal income opportunities for them to be able to work, but they're only able to work as long as they're also engaged in the educational activities. And again, having relatively high attendance again in these settings, these students increasing their academic achievements more than the one grade per year that you would expect. And so I think the discussions of the new federal legislation don't have, here's persistently dangerous to schools and here's the bad things that are going to happen to you. But I think as we're thinking about the entire continuum, we need to make sure that we're creating positive environments. And if the children have mental health or behavioral or substance abuse problems that are related, we need to make sure that making sure that they get those necessary services.
So I'll give you a short example. Back in 2002, 2003, we had 26,000 suspensions. As a district, academically, we failed to make AYP. As the number of suspensions has decreased, the rate and the number of students achieving at proficient and above has increased, and the district is no longer a district failing to make AYP, but we've actually made AYP. And so we don't think that's a coincidence, that you can't have students that are just kicked out the door at will for what we would consider to be soft offenses, those offenses where the more appropriate and the rational response would be in-school suspension, detention, work project. I'll give you a perfect example. This past week, we had 3 students at one of our high schools committed an act of graffiti. The real question for us was whether or not the appropriate consequence for them should be that they are arrested, that they are suspended or expelled, or they are given an opportunity to make the situation right and to repair the damage they've done to the school facility. We believe, and the Code of Conduct gives us that opportunity, that the right decision is about helping the young people to see the error of their ways, to make the situation right, and through that to learn that that's not how you take care of the community's property or your own property. And so I think that we spend a significant amount of time helping schools to develop strategies and implement things so that suspension isn't the only answer. It's merely one of many.
Okay, we do have a question from our online audience. For Mr. Bryce, what is the evidence that going for longer school days and going through much more of the summer to give children positive experiences throughout more months of the year has any impact? And has anything like that been done in Baltimore?
Okay, so great question. Evidence about longer school days and possibly extending the school year. Well, I'll answer that from looking at what the current information we have. Currently, we know that because of the length of the school year, that many students experience what researchers are calling a summer school loss. They experience a loss of the content knowledge that they've been taught in the previous year over the summer. We also understand that loss is exacerbated by students that are from a lower socioeconomic income, family condition, just because they may not have those additional resources in the family that will allow them to maintain that knowledge over time because of experiences, whether they're trips to the library, vacations, and other educational related experiences that could also be fun. If the question evolves to should a longer school year and a longer school day be something that is seriously considered, certainly it should be. Other countries have gone to a longer school day, a longer school year, but I think one of the great things that's on the surface for American public education are the Common Core standards. And because of the Common Core standards, for the first time, we're going to have the ability to really get a sense within the 21 or 23 states that have adopted the Common Core to see where students are across a wide path or swath of the country. So we're going to be able to see kids in North Carolina compared to kids in Maryland, compared to kids in Massachusetts, and really get a sense of, are they learning what they need in order to be successful? I think if you combine the Common Core with an assessment based on the Common Core, and then ask yourself the question, if students spend more time in school, could we get back to a place where we mandate physical education and fine arts education for all students? And could we afford to pay for it? If we could do that, I think our kids would be healthier. I think they would grow up and be better, well-rounded, and more able to enter college without the need for remediation.
There actually are some of the charter schools and the transformation schools do have longer days, but there are a number of out-of-school activities and after-school programs that Baltimore City has, and the data show that the students who go to the after-school programs who are from the same neighborhoods as the other children wind up achieving more during the year in terms of academic performance. And I think, as Jonathan alluded to, that the more opportunities that students have to learn and to be positively engaged in, and that unfortunately a number of students in Baltimore City and in other counties, their parents leave early in the morning to go to work. They don't get home till late at night. They may not be making all that much money, so there aren't a lot of discretionary funds that can be used for trips or for buying things, and that the stimulation that many of these young people have during the day in the summer is much less than they would have in school, and much less that children from higher incomes have. And that a lot of the loss is not it's really sort of not being continued to stimulate, not being able to sort of continue to use your thinking, being challenged to do problem solving just on your day-to-day activities, not necessarily going to formal schools, but for going to trips and educational activities and reading books and other kind of things. So clearly that how to engage young people for a longer period of time is critical, and in rural areas and suburbs where there are pockets of poverty, and certainly in urban areas, having these alternatives for students where the families are not able to pay for these themselves may be very important again, another way of making sure that all children are able to graduate to success and really be solid pillars of our society.
Do we have any other questions here? Any follow-up? No? Do you have anything else to add?
Yeah, so just a couple of comments. I think two things. One, I'll just follow up on what Phil just talked about. One of the things that educators we believe is that students that do the most do the best, right? So students that are more involved in the life of a school and the things that are going on in the classroom as well as after school, or that leave the school and go to one of the community-based after-school programs and summer programs that are offered, we do see that those students tend to be higher achieving and more engaged, and it really leads to better youth outcomes. I think the second piece goes back to something Phil mentioned earlier when he was talking about fair student funding and whether or not it's equitable to fund all students at the same level. What's interesting about the funding formula in Baltimore City Schools, fair student funding, is that there are weights given to students based on increased need. So there are weights given to students based on, or given to schools based on the types of students they serve. So if they're serving students that we know are going to need additional resources, the funding formula provides that for them, allowing them to have additional resources to either purchase personnel or to purchase some of the tools and the manipulatives that would allow them to work with their students to be successful. So that would be the only thing.
I guess the only thing I would add is that a lot of these advances that Baltimore has done, that other communities in Maryland have done, they don't take place by themselves. And so that most people in school systems are educators. Now, there may be a couple of people in the school system who aren't educators, but they're mostly educators, and that's their expertise. A lot of people in healthcare are not public educators. They may be educators around their specialties. One of the things that both through the local management boards in Maryland and in Baltimore City creating something called the Steering Committee for Safe and Supportive Learning Environments. We're able to bring together a lot of the stakeholders, both different city agencies, including the mayor and Dr. Alonso, but also some of the foundations, to talk about some of these things so that the attendance initiative, which was a school system, city schools, and a lot of other agencies, well, one of the partners who was sitting in that table was a local foundation, Open Society, and they sort of said, well, you know, you can meet a little bit, but we're never going to get where you're going to go unless you have some staff, and came up with some money so that the attendance initiative was provided some staff, and so that wasn't just only thinking about what could get done, but thinking about things that needed to get done, how they could be put in place. Many of things got put in place while the planning process was going on. So it wasn't making a report to go somebody else to do. It was the people who were actually involved in who could use this information. And I think having some of these things around youth violence, another example was the police used to change shifts at 3 o'clock. They still change shifts at 3 o'clock. Right. A lot of children were going home at 3 o'clock. There weren't too many police on those routes. Well, they at least rescheduled the routes. They put together a command center, so city police, school police, and transit police were all in the same place. So if there was an incident on the bus, the transit police person the bus operator didn't have to figure out which police unit am I supposed to call as I'm driving around Baltimore City. These things took place because there were people from different perspectives who were meeting on a common problem, keeping children safe and supportive, but it wasn't a school problem or community problem. The recognition was these were problems that sort of were shared between those of us who work in the schools, those of us who work in the community. And so I think part of the solution, again, is trying to be able to bring together folks to figure out what their assets and resources are so they can come to these common decisions and then hopefully implement them rapidly, as opposed to having a report that then has to go to a different agency to figure out how it's implemented.
Well, I mean, I think, Phil, you're absolutely correct that many of the incidents that city schools is attempting to resolve, or the issues, we certainly can't do it by ourselves, and it takes the entire Baltimore City community to really come to the table to help us strategize, and in some cases provide additional resources that are sort of like, you know, the one person or two additional researchers that can help us with a problem. Really, I think the result or the return on that investment is an exponential level of information and decisions that can be made at the school level or at the system level that really are making benefits or paying benefits and dividends to city schools.
Okay, great. I think that wraps up the day's presentation. Thank you again to Mr. Bryce and Dr. Leaf and everybody who joined us today, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.
Thank you.